Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Hello and welcome to another episode of Living the Dream with Curveball. I'm your host, Curveball, and today I am joined by a very special guest. We're going to be talking about grief. She is an author, a speaker, and a licensed therapist with more than 20 years of experience. She is also a grief expert. So, Edy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here.
Well, why don't you start off by giving the audience a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So grief is usually one of those topics that nobody wants to talk about. And I really met grief pretty early on, and maybe not the way that somebody might think of grief, like the loss of a loved one, or a grandmother dies or a pet dies. And, as a child, certainly losing a pet can bring about a big grief reaction. But we face a lot of different types of grief as we go through life. And that grief can be bullying, that grief can be cruelty, that grief can be sexual abuse, that grief can just be, and take so many different paths and angles. And so I really started this conversation with grief, as a young girl. And then as I matured and fell in love, and lost love is also a part of grief, and then lost a partner when I was 27 years old, and it just about, I don't know, killed me, I think, because it took me into areas that I never thought I'd want to go or needed to go. His death changed the trajectory of my life, and I became hungry to understand grief and how it functions and how we live with it and how we maybe can dance with it.
So when you say dance with grief, explain what you mean by that.
Sure. Too often we think about grief as something that we want to keep as far away from us as possible. And when we try to push something away, it's like anxiety. Like when we try to ignore anxiety and how anxiety feels, you know what happens? It gets bigger. And grief is the same way. When we feel its grip, like we're in this pandemic and we've been suffering through it, and there's been isolation and depression and anxiety and high rates, unfortunately, of suicide. And when we can learn how to partner with what feels like an adversary, it perhaps can teach us how to get into the depths of the soul, of the self. And so I use the metaphor of the dance, because sometimes when we dance with someone, it's great, and sometimes they step on our toes.
So tell us about the stages of grief. What are the stages of grief that people go through when they're grieving?
So I'm thrilled that you asked that question, because the way that I think of grief is actually not through what is called, in psychological terms, stage theory. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a wonderful engineer of getting us to start to talk about grief and loss. The thing is that when she wrote the 5 stages of grief, what she wrote about was the stages for someone who was dying. And I really talk to people, not necessarily who are dying, but really the survivors of a loss, the survivors of a breakup. And so I really look at this, instead of stages, as phases, and that they move in and out of one another, also like a dance. And in the movement that they make between all of these varied emotions, from emotional armor, which I think of as the first go-to, all the way down, and there are 11 of them that I cite in my book, that, it's grief, the dance of self-discovery through trauma and loss, that in the book, I go from the emotional armor where we need to protect ourselves. Some of it is by choice. Some of it we are not choosing. All the 11th phase, which is grace. You've come to terms with the grief, but it doesn't go away. It's just not pressing on you as hard. And in between, but there's anger and there's rage and there's anxiety and there's role confusion. Who am I during this pandemic where there's been like this grief? Who am I now that I've lost my partner? Who am I because I've been shot? Who am I? Who am I? And those are all parts of grief.
Well, let me ask this question because I've always considered grief being, like you said, the death of a loved one, even losing a partner. I've never really saw that as grief. So how would a person that maybe see things the way that I do before I talk to you, how do they actually know that they are grieving and know that they might need help or that they might need to dance with it like you talk about?
So when we think about like stages, and then we move into this other perspective, if it's not from the loss of a loved one, as you say, I think that the grief can feel like we're not our optimal selves. We feel a depth of loss, of yearning. Life does not feel comfortable on any level. When we see a loved one being harmed and we can't do anything about it, there's grief there. When we feel that we can't speak up and sometimes we need to find our silence, there's grief there. And when someone comes into my office, I don't ask them to tell me their story. I ask them what they're yearning for. I ask them what they're hungry for. Because the unmet hunger and the yearning, the unmet yearning is grief. And it begins that conversation in a very real, dedicated, and honest way to approach the yearning and the hunger as a response to something that is affecting that person from living their best lives with their best selves.
So speaking of coming into your office, you have a unique way in your practice of helping your clients deal with grief. So explain what methods you use to help your clients when they come into your office for a session and they're grieving.
When someone comes into my office, as I said, I'm going to ask them what you're yearning for. The paradigm that I use is that they're on a hero's journey. And from my perspective, we're all on a hero's journey. And what that hero's journey looks like is we start with the ordinary self, and then we get struck by whatever causes that grief. Maybe it's illness, maybe it is a loss of a loved one, maybe it's a loss of a limb, or maybe it's somebody who's just bullied us to shreds. And that is the moment when something changes within our bodies, within our brains. And then as you're moving through that hero's journey, you say, no, this isn't happening. And then there's all this denial and you push it away and you push it away. And then you enter into the hero's cave, and that cave is dark and it's deep, and it's where you must face yourself. I see the work of the therapy as really looking at the self. And I do that in a myriad of ways, from storytelling to sometimes working with clay, to sometimes sharing a book, doing exercises such as role play, such as creating amazing masks where my client is given a blank mask, and I will do this like in a group. And each person is given this blank mask, and they are asked to sit with this mask and write on it or draw on it. And believe it or not, when you take what is going on inside of you and you put it onto something, whether it's a mask or into a journal, or you're havoc within your soul and your psyche, and it releases you. Combined with that, I use something called EMDR, which is a wonderful technique that helps to move the way the brain holds on to trauma, and through different ideas of how you're going to think about something, it can actually change the way that your brain holds on to the trauma and the grief. And it's utilizing left brain and right brain. It's an eye movement. You follow a finger or you follow a dot, or actually you listen to beeps that move from left to right. And it's actually working the brain while you're changing the way you hold on to the thinking around the grief or the trauma.
You say that grief is personal evolution, integration, and something everyone can master. Explain what you mean by that, and what are the ways that we can master grief?
Well, I do believe that you master it by joining it instead of fighting it. And grief is an unexpected ally. It takes us to places we never thought we'd go, we wouldn't choose to go. And yet it is an ally. And it helps us to perhaps look deep into ourselves. And the mastery is not that you get over it, because I don't know, losing someone is so hard and so devastating. And if we just even think about that kind of loss, the mastery of the grief is not about forgetting. It's about learning how to remember more peacefully. It's about integrating it, and integrating it in such a way that you know it's there, but it doesn't take you down.
You are listening to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast with my guest, Edy Nathan. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break.
The question was, have we got any funny or embarrassing travel stories?
I was flying back from one of the CSUN technology conferences, and a person got in beside me, a lady. She was all on for a big chat. I was not all on for a big chat. And I said, I difficult for me English because I not... So I pretend. So that was fine. She stopped talking. And an hour or so into the flight, the drinks trolley came round.
Oh my God! Yeah, now
and
you're
the,
trapped.
and the air hostess says,
"Welcome back to
can I get you? I said, could I have a Carlsberg, please?" In my Irish accent.
Subscribe to your Blank Eyes Chat wherever you get your podcast. Always read the label. May cause hysteria. Terms and conditions do not apply.
Is you deal with grief, but you're also a sex therapist. Could you explain to the audience what that means and what you provide in that area?
Certainly. As a sex therapist, I work with trauma because I could see that my work with grief was often around people coming in and feeling grief, the grief over aging, and the grief over maybe women who would come in and have painful sex, or men who would come in and they're saying, I can't perform the way I used to. And the grief and the sense of loss of self because they couldn't be who they used to be. And the mourning around that was extensive. And then the sexual and physical and emotional abuses that unfortunately too many people face in their lives, that the sexual issues around that were extensive. And so it led me into becoming a sex therapist so that I could really work with the whole person. You know, our sexuality is part of what defines us. And sometimes there are people who question their sexuality or question their gender, and they are infinitely isolated as a result. And So just being able to help people navigate through their own grief reactions and trauma as it relates to their bodies and as it relates to their souls, and the language that they have about caring for the whole, all of the parts of them. And that's how I became a sex therapist. Sex therapy is a field that anybody can call themselves a sex therapist, but there's actually a certification that goes on, and it's lengthy, and the process of the education is powerful. And if any of your listeners ever think about, reaching out to a sex therapist, just make sure that they've got certification. It is really, really important.
When you deal with people that's dealing with different types of grief, do you do things different, or do you treat everybody the same? Like, for example, if somebody comes in and they've lost a partner, or somebody comes in needing sex therapy, how do you determine, what are some of the ways you determine how you deal with each situation that you face with your clients on a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. Grief is like your fingerprint, and everyone has a different fingerprint. So I work with everyone as they are. And that means that I don't have some pre-planned method of working with them. It's going to be what we do together is going to depend on their story and their sense of safety, and how much, they feel they can be pushed, or how much they want to shift. Because sometimes people think that the work of the therapy doesn't really require their presence, and it really does. It's a union, if you will, that gets formed, and that union is sacred. And I will never expect somebody to walk into my office or into a group or into a large training and think, oh, they're going to trust me. They should not trust me. The last thing they should do is trust me. That needs to be earned. And so the process is delicate. It's slow. It depends on if someone has ever had any kind of therapy before, or if it's brand new. It depends on if they are able to actually talk about what's going on, or if it's so deeply buried that they don't even have a language around it. So it is not a one size fits all. I've got blouses like that, but I certainly don't have therapy like that.
Tell us about your book and give us the name of it. Tell us where we can purchase it, and kind of give us a brief breakdown of what we can expect when we read your book. Sure.
Yeah. The book is called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. You could buy it on Amazon, or if you come to my website, I also have it on my website, as well as some other really cool stuff on the website. So there's going to be quizzes. I don't have the quiz up yet, but there's a grief quiz, and there's going to be blogs there. So it's edynathan.com, and Edy is spelled E-D-Y, and my last name is Nathan.com. The book is really broken down into different sections, but I would say the tenet of the book is that what grief does is it kind of causes you to take a look at the self. And when you can get to know you, then you'll have a better understanding of the kind of help you need. And what that means is, if you're an introvert, I'm not going to tell you to go to a group. I may not even suggest that you see one person. Maybe you just talk to a friend who's non-judgmental and who can hold you and witness you in your pain. And that may be the best help you can get. If you're an extrovert, maybe you want to join a group, and you want to have some individual therapy, and you're also talking to your friends. And if you're somewhere in the middle, and that's called an ambivert, well, maybe you'll do a little bit of both. You'll need to go inside, but you can also seek help externally. And that I have three different kind of personality positions, and one of those happens to be the introvert extrovert eclipse, and then there are two others. So there's a whole chapter on assessing the self, and so when you know yourself, you will know you have a better sense of the kind of help that will be a better fit for you. And then the 11 phases, and then the tools, from breathing to this EMDR that I just mentioned, and journaling, and talking to a friend, and owning the self, learning to have a voice, learning to say, no, I don't want to talk about it, not now.
Do you have any projects, upcoming projects, or any speaking engagements, or anything that you're working on right now that the listeners need to know about?
Well, I have just started a new project with a group of 3 folks, and we call ourselves the Pivot Quest. And actually, that's also a website. And if you go onto the website, there's a free 35-minute talk about resilience and risk. And I talk about superpowers and grief. And then there's a booklet that also is a free download. And it's a very, very exciting project that feels like it's going to be extremely expansive. So that's certainly one piece. And I've got a couple of books in the works right now. One is called Ghost Self, and the other is T is for Trauma. So there's a lot happening right now, and it's very, very exciting.
Well, give us your social media links. Tell us what platforms you're on, so that way we can keep up with all the exciting things that you're doing, because it sounds like you're a busy woman.
I love the idea of giving and gifting people who are like me out there just trying to make things work. And the best way to find me on social media, if you put my name into Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn, if you go to my website, all of those links are there. They're right there. So you can just go immediately there. But if you just put in my name, Edy Nathan, you'll find me. And as well, even on Amazon, you just put in EDYNATHAN, and I'm right there on Amazon. And those are platforms where you can learn more about me, but also I want to hear from you. I want to hear what's going on with you. I want to hear how you're holding up during this time, and how your voice has maybe become clearer to you, or what you've learned, because that's all part of this conversation. It's less about me and more about you.
Well, we're definitely about to make it more about you. Do you have any final thoughts before we close it out?
One of my favorite movies is The Wizard of Oz. And there's something about her red shoes. And those red shoes are about power. And I believe that we all have power, even if we don't recognize it, that we can tap into it. So the way that I like to end is, you've had the power all along. Now use it.
Definitely. And listeners, while you're using that power, please also use it to follow, rate, review, share, and tell a friend after listening to this episode. Edy Nathan. Edy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. This was lovely.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.